Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. This is a Property Observer event, a live webcast, and we're talking about off-the-plan marketing. We've got 4 experts that have been kind enough to come along tonight. So we have John Ellis from the Investorus website, Sam Tarascio from Salta, Andrew Leoncelli from CBRE, and James Herbert from Austin. Thank you very much for coming. And look, let's just say that I guess the backdrop is that Australian cities are like many other international cities in that there is this global trend towards apartment living. And I guess that's showing up in both the younger generation and the older generation, and amongst Australians and international citizens. And I guess at the core of that is the desire to live close to the CBD, or certainly on key transport routes. And so the demand that is being is out there by buyers is certainly being the property developers are soaking it up and making sure that there is an extraordinary amount of choice that buyers can avail themselves of. And I guess tonight we will look at some of the key issues from a property professional perspective. So we'll work out, how do property developers sell out mega residential projects? Where can financial planners find off-the-plan projects on one website? And what is all the fuss with China? We'll get a little bit into design and a lot about location, and also about the marketing behind the success stories that we read about every Monday morning in the newspapers and on the websites. So I guess the first question we can perhaps discuss is just who is it that is buying off the plan? And I guess, shall we start with Andrew? Who is it that's buying off the plan?
Well, there's 2 distinct groups that we sell to across our projects, and they're owner-occupiers and they're locals, and they're first and second time buyers, and they're mature age buyers, downsizing, and then there's the investor. And the investor comes from all over Australia, and it comes from Southeast Asia. So you know, the market's deep and broad, but there's 2 distinct categories, owner-occupiers and investors. And then within each category, of course, there's quite a different and distinct a number and categories of different buyers within each of them.
And presumably, is it the same in every capital city, or are there subtle differences, or not so subtle differences?
I don't think there's such subtle differences, no. If you look at Australia, we're growing rapidly, nearly twice the global population rate Australia's growing at. It's nearly 2% compared to a global average of about 1.2. So Australia's getting the lion's share of capital population growth. As a result, our cities are growing. We're getting skilled migrants coming into the major cities, and the demand on apartments, as you said, around key places of employment, CBD, South Bank, Docklands here in Melbourne, but the key drivers for employment, that's really what's driving the apartment market, and affordability is critical. So typically apartments are bought by younger people, just generally, but the downsizers now are starting to accept apartment living and the conveniences as a really accepted way of living. Over the last 20 years, Australians are accepted apartments way more than ever before, and every day that gets better.
Sam, out at Abbotsford, on, I guess you'd call it the fringe of the CBD, what was the makeup of the buying public out there?
Yeah, I think it depends on the, if you like, the sentiment in the market at a given point in time. We completed a project 2 years ago in Richmond, and the buyer profile there was probably 15% overseas and the balance local. So the majority of buyers were local at that time, and in fact we had to hold back the overseas sales. We could have sold a lot more overseas, but the market was very, very strong at that point in time, and therefore you know, there was a lot more local buyers. You know, over the last few years, the market has been you know, more challenging from a local point of view, and it's been the overseas buyers who've probably been the stronger buyer cohort. And so the project that we're just settling now probably is about a 50-50 split between local buyers and overseas buyers. And I think predominantly because locally there's been a lot reported in the media about the potential for oversupply of apartments and the potential for prices to come off, which we don't agree with. I just don't think, for everything that Andrew mentioned before, I don't think the apartment market will slow significantly, but I think it's just what locals hear in the media that has changed that mix. I think that's going to change quite rapidly.
So I guess
back the other way.
If anyone knows the wave of Chinese interest in the country, it would be James, who is the head of sales and marketing at Austin. Have you noticed what Sam's noticed, and that is, I guess, different waves of proportion of overseas buyers based on, I guess, local and international factors?
Yeah, well, so Austin Group specialise in distributing sales from Australia into mainland China. So all of our clients come from mainland China.
But what percentage of the mix do you reckon they are of completed sales in various developments? I mean, I guess would there be apartment blocks where almost 50% were Chinese buyers in the end, perhaps on a Beckett Street, as opposed to 25% or 100%?
So my guess would be that about 50% of most developments with a close proximity to the Melbourne CBD would be sold to Asian buyers.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to chip in there and say it's probably the focus on purely Chinese buyers is probably not correct. We're getting a large proportion of overseas buyers from Malaysia, yes, and Singapore and China, and it's reasonably evenly split.
I guess it's an easy headline, isn't it, the Chinese buyers, but I mean, for instance, the Property Observer readership, of our international readership, the strongest overseas contingent are the Malaysians, followed by the Singaporeans, followed by the Chinese. That's so right. We know in terms of overseas interest in property stories, that's the ranking. What's Investor's point of origin sales indicate?
So our membership base probably more dictates where our buyers are from, and half of our members are located in Australia, half internationally through Asia, and that split is about a quarter in Singapore and Malaysia and a quarter in China. So we're co-hosted in China, but in Singapore and Malaysia it's very easy to move. And certainly the buyers and the traffic that we experience through our site is stronger internationally than it is domestically, I think because of the difficulties in communication over distance.
Right.
Historically, Singapore and Malaysian buyers have come to Australia for education. So the Chinese are new to Australia. I think, we chatted briefly before, and James mentioned property ownership in China only started in 1998. So I mean, it's a relatively new thing. And so we're having a recent wave of Chinese buyers, and that's coming. So they're definitely coming, the Chinese, but the Singaporeans and the Malaysians have been buying Melbourne for 20 years. And they've been buying for educational purposes. And the skilled migration story out of both those two countries is stronger than out of China. But of course it's changing.
That's absolutely true. If you look at FIRB stats from last year, Singapore and Malaysia combined is the same as, or is actually in excess of China in terms of their investment in residential property. So those areas cannot be forgotten.
So why let's talk about the international buyer as opposed to the local investor, but let's look at both of them. Why are they buying? And do you want to kick off,
yeah,
James?
I'm happy to do that. I think diversifying capital is an important point. Children,
this is for the international buyers.
Especially we're just looking at our clients, diversifying capital out of China. Children's education. As Andrew mentions before, potential future residency for themselves as well. And I think that what Australia offers is sound financial institutes, a very good public and private school system, as well as excellent universities as well. We have a liberal democratic government here. We have a part of the APEC region as well. We have a similar time zone, of course, as well, that's important, and then a reputation for a safe, clean and beautiful living environment.
And I think the key thing there too, James, is the global affordability of our property.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know, the downside of our stock is so limited, you know, on a global, you know, particularly Asian-based sort of comparative basis, is so low and so insignificant that, you know, the Chinese, Singaporeans, Malaysians, they're buying one-bedrooms here for practically half the price of what they're paying for in their local economy. So the affordability of our entry-level stock is a big draw card too.
But it's also really important to note that in Australia they can fund that investment as well. So they can borrow up to 80% on their investment without any trouble, where they cannot do that in their home countries.
Yeah, lots of cooling measures in each of those 3 territories we've mentioned, actively trying to take the heat out of the capital growth in those domestic markets naturally encourages investors to look elsewhere. And so they look to Australia. It's a stable economy, as James said, politically stable, relatively high yields compared to the cost of the debt that they get to borrow. You know, the other countries have incredibly low interest rates. Australia has 2.5%, the lowest in 60 years in Australia, but by global standards actually quite high. So their ability to borrow in local currency or in domestic currency and get an investment that's at least cash flow neutral, if not potentially cash flow positive, is a real driver too.
What was the influence, or the effect of the Kevin Rudd change in the allowing developers to move from a 50% sale offshore to 100%? I mean, did developers jump at it with gusto, or did things carry on almost as per normal, depending on the rationale behind a project?
No, so every project that has more than 100 apartments naturally goes and gets FIRB approval, gives the developer the ability to sell the entire project overseas, but it comes with rules. You know, they must advertise and give the local buyers every opportunity to buy. So you cannot just go and sell your project entirely overseas. You must give a domestic purchaser the opportunity to buy. But the Australian banks have been the main driver around the volume of international sales, that domestic developers who rely on that domestic debt to be able to sell into that market. So it's the international clients recently who get their debt funding from overseas that don't have that restriction. So suddenly we have more projects sold in greater numbers overseas? The answer would be yes. It's a combination of factors. It's not just Kevin Rudd's change in the FIRB approval.
And in fact, there was some data out this week that showed that of the big 2 cities, Sydney and Melbourne, half the developments are in the control of overseas developers. And so therefore, as you say, they aren't relying on the local funding that the Australian developers are.
Yeah. And that's a strategic advantage. It means they can sell more of their stock overseas into an active and deep pipeline. Is there a price differentiation between the rival developers in domestic versus international? No, it's illegal to have 2-tier pricing. There's one price list, yeah, for a domestic purchaser or an international purchaser. So it's actually against the law to have 2 tiers of pricing.
Right.
Yeah.
Market forces prices will need to be consistent, because if you're more expensive than the next project, well, why would a buyer buy?
Absolutely. And overseas developers are still selling through the same channels as domestic developers. So they're still, when a purchaser from an international purchaser purchases in Australia, they do so with the assistance of an advisor on the whole, and those advisors are still looking for the best value for money for their clients, regardless of the location of the
So any suggestion of 2-tier pricing is inaccurate. And there was a suggestion that Point Cook was rife with 2-tier pricing, the house and land packages.
I don't know.
But in the apartment market, you believe that it's
total transparency.
Right. Yeah. Sam, tell us about the local investors. Mm-hmm. Let's leave the Chinese and the Malaysians and the Singaporeans for a moment. Tell us about the local investors. Why are they buying? What do they see as attractive?
Australians have a natural desire to buy and own property. So a lot of investors, once they've got the family home and they've got equity in the family home, the next logical thing is, well, where do I put that equity that I've built up. Now, some people feel comfortable, say, putting money into the share market, and others feel comfortable putting money into property. And property, I think, is perceived as as a very safe haven, for your money, as Andrew's mentioned. The downside, particularly in the apartment market, really is limited. And from our point of view, we can't see how it can go down because of just the fundamental cost issues that prevent new projects from being priced any cheaper than anything that exists. So it is a very safe market. Obviously, there's the tax benefits to an investor, the negative gearing benefits that they get, and the historic appreciation in value in property, has been for the old sort of rule of thumb is every 10 years it sort of doubles. Now, whether it does a bit more than that or a bit less than that, no one can really predict. But the reality is prices in the local market do rise. Because of the natural cost pressures that are keeping the cost of delivery of new projects always rising. That just drags the rest of the market along with it. And where we've got significant population growth in Australia, and in the medium term probably an undersupply of housing, it means that you've got to keep producing, and you can only produce at the rate that the economy allows you to produce at, which is always increasing. So, buying property is a good way of accumulating wealth over a long period of time, and I think that's attractive to local buyers.
Just one stat on that, Sam, is that broadly speaking, every home within 10 kilometres of the Melbourne, just using Melbourne as an example, Melbourne CBD, has over the last 20 years increased 600%. And that's the average home. I use my grandparents as a great example. They paid $308,000 nearly 20 years ago, and they've sold their house for 1.5 million, done nothing but live in it. So it's that extra equity that you said, Sam, before, that suddenly, these generations of people have, they've made it through doing basically nothing, living. So it is a safe investment. They know it, they understand it. The local area investor is a very big part of the apartment market here in Melbourne in particular.
Absolutely, and it's really important to note, Jonathan, that the property landscape, the Australian property landscape for investors is changing, largely because of superannuation. So we've got hundreds of new members that have come that specialise in how to buy investment property in their super fund.
It is interesting, isn't it, that almost every of the big data suppliers, whenever houses have gone up 10%, units have gone up 8%, or if it's 5% for houses, it's 3%. Despite the amazing rush of new apartments, apartment price growth has kept its sort of proportion to house price growth. Is that what you find?
That's absolutely fair. Yeah.
Well, no. The reason I would give for that is that you can't build a large apartment development unless you've pre-sold it. In the rare case where you might be an overseas developer and you've got cash, maybe you can, but generally you can't build until you've pre-sold. You're not going to do a project unless you're actually making a return on it. And as I said before, the costs are always lifting. So, that's why I think you'll see apartments always keeping pace with the price growth of, if you like, standard homes.
We hear about projects selling out and selling out. You can't get in there. Is it true? And how do people get in there so that they can buy an investment property? Do you want to start, Andrew?
Well, I mean, we've just sold one out literally in the last 2 weeks. A small boutique project in Seymour Grove in Camberwell. It's 26 apartments, all sold to local owner-occupiers and local area investors. No international purchases, no overseas sales, no big seminars. Locals 100% sold. Sold 62 in Hampton Street, Hampton recently. We did 332 in St Kilda Road, Melbourne 3004 in the last part of last year. 100% sold. You can't get into those projects. Every apartment sold and contracted. So absolutely it happens. But there's plenty of opportunity to get into them. You just got to be quick.
So is there a herd mentality, and is that herd mentality a good or bad thing, or is it just buzz and marketing? Am I wrong to call it a herd mentality?
Well, look, it's probably a combination of all those factors. There's a bit of herd. We sell in an open display suite and we create tension, but the tension comes because there's lots of people chasing limited stock. And in that, in the good quality projects, they sell out. You know, the really good quality projects, well priced, good value for money in great locations, they do the best.
Do the overseas buyers buy in a hurry? It's often said that overseas buyers don't like buying at Australian auctions, even though I'm not sure that that's true as much as it used to be. But what do you think, James, as far as overseas buyers? Do they buy hastily or in a considered way? What motivates their purchasing and the sellout of the projects that they're particularly keen on?
Well, if you look at Ausen Group specialise in launching residential developments off the plan and achieving a very high volume of sales in a very short period of time. And the reason why we can do that is because our market is a very sophisticated market. They've been buying apartments for a long time, and they are able to make decisions very quickly.
But James, am I right in saying that your team will work with one individual for quite a long period of time until they're really at that time in the market and that point in their decision-making process?
Yeah, sure. Doing business in China is all about relationships, and so we work very, very hard at that. But I think coming back to the question about the ability to be able to act quickly, then that our clients make decisions, basically come in on the weekend and sign up contracts because they understand, they're well educated especially on the market here, and they're able to make those decisions quickly.
The Richmond project, Sam, sold. I think the first stage sold out within 3 months, didn't it? It was
Yep.
Why? And
well, I mean, I guess at that point there was a lack of supply in that area of the market. The product was priced very carefully so that there was good value for money. The location, being Richmond, Abbotsford, has always been a sought-after location, but also reasonably difficult from a planning point of view to actually get projects out of the ground. So, there was just a lot of pent-up demand for that stock at that time, and obviously made the sales process a lot easier. I mean, don't kid yourself. Selling projects out is a lot of hard work. You might launch a project and yes, it sells in a weekend, but there's a hell of a lot of work leading up to that, which is having buyers that are well educated. So that your agents who are working for you are making these connections on a constant basis and keeping buyers informed. Ourselves as developers are doing the same thing. We're reworking the database of buyers that we've had and keeping people informed. And I guess the question you asked a bit earlier was how do you get in? If when these things are selling so quickly, the key to that is to actually be working with an agent or a developer and keeping an eye out on the pre-release information we have. That gives those gives buyers the ability to get in at those early stages.
Well, I guess we can perhaps backtrack a tiny little bit and just, we sort of know what off the plan is, but what actually is it? What are you actually selling? It's effectively something that's not there. So it's obviously an extraordinary art and project marketing, that goes with it is obviously, a specialty area. So what is your role in project marketing? Andrew, do you want to?
Geez, I mean, our involvement starts from the time a developer looks at a parcel of land.
Right.
Product positioning, product mix, size and shape of stock, who's the customer, who's the target market. It is months and months of research and work to go in to give the developer confidence to buy the site, then to lodge the town planning application, what mix of stock, how many of what type, what kind of car parking system. So that can be 12 months of work before actually we get a permit, before we actually commence the marketing phase of it, which is the deliverables, and then create the sales strategy to match the marketing materials and then to basically roll out the sales strategy. So, we can do 2 years worth of work before we begin selling anything. But your question before was, what are we selling? We're selling a lot on a proposed plan of subdivision. That's the only thing we're selling, which is vision. We're selling vision, not reality. We're not real estate agents that get the benefit of taking somebody through a completed, finished home. We are selling what will be built, and we typically do that on site. You know, the easiest way to actually orientate somebody and to convey the quality, the aspect, the mood, you know, the atmosphere of living in that area is by building a display suite on site, and by actually showing the customer a built example, prototype kitchen, bathroom, living area, three-dimensional model, alternative and very, very well done computer generated images of what it's like to live in that apartment. But really what they're buying on the contract is a lot on a proposed plan of subdivision, which we hope, all things going well, eventually turns into their home.
So one of the attractions for off the plan in Australia for overseas buyers is that we're perceived as relatively safe compared to the systems that exist elsewhere in the world, where if you buy off the plan, you know, you might be paying a much higher deposit, or you might even be paying progress payments. So you're effectively funding the developer. Whereas in Australia, you put your 10% down and there's nothing to pay until the very end. And if the developer fails, your 10% is actually held on trust and you get it back. Once all the dust settles. So it's effectively, it's a guaranteed. It's a safe investment. You can buy off the plan in Australia, feeling confident that you're either going to get your product delivered, and if you've chosen the right developer who's got the right builder, you'll get a good product. And if something happens, a developer can't get funding, or the project falls over in some way, then in Australia you're well protected. Overseas, and I've seen this in other countries, there are buildings that are half finished that have been partly paid for by buyers who have no way of extracting their money. It's a really big strength of the Australian system. That was
Dubai for about 6 years there.
Yep.
John, your online website is a relative newcomer.
Absolutely.
And I guess, how do you see its role in project marketing? It obviously helps the transparency because as a property professional going to it, you can see everything about the development there, and you can actually proceed with a sale in the initial forms just on that website.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do two things. We do relationships and we do technology. So our relationships are our 1,700 plus members that come to our site daily and search through. We now have over $6 billion worth of Australian product listed. So our relationship component is putting those guys, who are all advisors, in touch with developers and project marketers. So we put James in touch with Sam and Andrew. And from a technology point of view, we've got some fairly sophisticated search and methodology and data that we feed into that site that allows people to complete that full transaction online.
I think from our point of view too, John, what Investrist also offers is a management tool. You know, you have this problem in the past of spreadsheets flying all over the place, and you know, an apartment potentially being sold twice if you're selling in two markets at the same time, and you need a system to actually bring it all together and manage it. And actually Investrist also provides that, which I think is a fantastic.
And as Andrew said, I mean, sometimes there can be 500 lots or 1,000 lots that are actually available for sale, and a red dot on a wall is not necessarily the safest measure.
Correct. And it's interesting you ask how do projects get sold, and Andrew's very right. They get sold by terrific marketing and by people like him designing not only the unit but the strategy for sale. Our research says about 70% of all off-the-plan projects on the eastern seaboard are sold using some form of intermediary. So they're sold using those relationships and using advisors. If you think yourself, James, and you have put yourself in the position of one of your customers, they come to Ausen, even though they know the Australian market really well, but they don't jump onto Domain and go, I want to buy an apartment in Australia, because it's too hard. They don't know the contracts, how to manage that contract, how to manage the sale all the way through. So they go to someone like Ausen. Correct.
Because Ausen looks after immigration, financing, wealth managers as well, don't they? So in a sense, the Chinese clients can have a whole suite of work done for them.
Yeah, that's right, and that's critically important to our business model. To be able to support our clients, to be able to provide, the best knowledge, and to them, and also services that that allow them to get the best service, the best advice here when purchasing is critically important.
If I was a suburban accountant or a self-managed super fund trustee and with clients, how is it best for them to get in at ground level to get access? And I mean, Sam, you mentioned it before, that it would appear daunting, but the truth is everything is accessible. It's not a private club.
No, look, at the end of the day, there's no secret. If you're launching a project, you want to sell them. Okay, so if someone comes to you and says, look, we're interested in your next project, can we be on your database? You're not going to say no. So you do that, and I would suggest that for advisors acting on behalf of their clients, that's what they do. They need to identify those developers that they feel confident in, and they need to get a brief from their client as to what location they're sort of looking at, and just keep their eyes peeled for what projects fit within those criteria, and make sure they get themselves in front of either the agent or the developer that's delivering the project. And they'll get the early information. And
they should naturally be a member of Investors.
Of course.
Yeah.
Andrew? I mean, where do your buyers come from? They can't all be mates of yours.
No. So the CBRE database grows with every project, which is a good thing. But we're retail advertisers. We go into the proven forms of media that attract the local buyer. And it's print media, it's direct mail pieces, it's online, digital, which is changing and evolving every day. We go into the public realm to attract buyers to our projects, and we do that very well. We do that in a way that's very effective, it's very strategic, it's very cost effective, and it delivers amazing results. So we've actually got very good tools at going into the marketplace and getting people to inquire.
Tell me about the importance of design, because it would seem to me that the architects are getting better. Sometimes the apartments might be getting smaller, but the architects are smarter.
Architects and interior designers. Yeah. So in a market like Melbourne, where there's a lot of competing product, and apartments now, and Melbourne's matured, and the apartment market's maturing. The buyer sophistication's gone through the roof. They travel the world. They've been to Asia, they've been to Europe, they've seen world's best practice. They've come back to Australia and seen design over, 90s and early 2000s that wasn't particularly great. And they're demanding every day better and better level of finish and a higher standard and smarter design and better storage and more effective floor planning. And so architecture and interior design has gone through the roof. And as a way of differentiating yourself in a competitive marketplace, the smart developers are embracing and paying for good design, and they're working with project marketers and good interior designers to come up with the best quality product, because that's what the owner-occupier wants, and that's what smart local area investors are buying. And there's clear differences in the quality of product that's on the Melbourne market at this point in time.
Sam, you've used SJB?
Yes, we have. Yep.
Did you use architects in the old days, or was it relatively new?
No, we've always used architects, yep. And it's a very important. They're an extremely important part of the whole design process, obviously. But one of the things you have to do after you've completed every project is be very critical of yourself. And every project that we complete, we go back in, and we usually give ourselves, a month or two after completing, and go through a number of apartments and say, right, what did we do wrong and what did we do right, and where can we improve? And that's how you make sure that every project, every subsequent project you do, you eliminate the errors that you made previously, and you hopefully come up with better ideas for not just finishes, but functionality of how, just how the apartment works for an occupier. And the other thing I'd say is that's becoming more and more important is the quality of your common areas and your communal zones and the size of those. As apartments by necessity have got smaller because of the affordability issue, what's become more and more important is just what are those common areas, and it's more than now than just a swimming pool poked in the back corner. If you're going to have amenity, it's got to be good amenity, and it's got to be in an area of the project that actually adds value rather than just plugging it in a corner.
I presume you gave yourself a tick for record price for an Australian apartment up there in East Melbourne?
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, obviously, you know, that particular apartment project was targeted at a very different market, but I think it's a market that actually will grow in Australia, which is the owner-occupier market. That building, we talk about the mix of investors versus owner-occupiers, and you know, that's probably got a 95% owner-occupier profile. Those apartments were designed essentially to be houses in the sky, and we're talking about 150 Clarendon Street, for those who don't know, in East Melbourne. But you know, what they were was essentially transplanting people who were in houses into a large apartment, so that they, you know, have plenty of space, but they don't have the daily hassle of the garden and the pool and everything else. Everything is basically taken care of, and we were able to achieve record prices in that project for the Melbourne market at the time, an average rate of $17,000 a metre, which was extremely high when the average, you know, standard apartment was probably $8,000 a metre at the time.
And there was DA approval. The sisters had obtained DA approval for 200 or more. You cut it back to 80 something apartments.
Well, what we recognised was that site was absolutely unique, and you come across very few of these sites, you know, in a whole career. I mean, that sort of location in East Melbourne, where everything else is height limited and directly overlooking the garden towards the city, with a view of the city that you actually can't get from anywhere else. We recognised that, you know, putting smaller apartments into that location, firstly, the community didn't like, so there was no support from the East Melbourne residents for the project that had been approved, and it just didn't seem up to us to sort of fit within the demographic profile of that location. So we took a big punt at the time, and we did what was, for Melbourne in particular, a pioneering project in terms of trying to deliver that size and price point and quality of apartments. But it paid off because I think we read the market correctly.
And you had $1 million one-bedroom apartments, and of course recently in Sydney at Barangaroo, there was the 1 million one-bedroom apartments there. The 17,000 per square metre is Sydney. That's about 5-6 years ago. But now, Andrew, you see the Sydney price per square metre at around, in the CBD, about 19,000 a square metre, don't you?
19,500 for one bedrooms without cars, and it's grown literally from about 15,000 in the last 24 months. So the rapid price growth in Sydney has been astronomical in the off-the-plan market, and that's been driven by overwhelming and pent-up demand and a fundamental lack of supply. And those two things are crashing together in Sydney at this point in time. But it creates an enormous opportunity for Melbourne, where we're $9,500 to $10,000 a square metre sort of maximum in the city. You know, so we're basically half as expensive on a per square metre basis as the Sydney CBD. Melbourne's growing, we're growing quicker than Sydney. There's a good story in Melbourne. And we think we're starting to get a bit more of the lion's share of the international investor now, starting to say, well, geez, Sydney's grown and Sydney's expensive now relative to Melbourne. Let's have a look at Melbourne.
So is that happening, James? Is the Chinese interest swinging towards Melbourne, or because of the Sydney price?
Yeah, about 60% of our sales are done in Melbourne. We have a huge underlying demand for Sydney projects, but supply there recently has been, has been difficult to get involved in. So it's easier to buy here in Melbourne. As Andrew says before, it's a lot cheaper and obviously a lot more obtainable.
We are taking questions if the listening audience wants to ask questions via the web, so fire away in the last 10 minutes. Sam, what are key attributes to an apartment? And apartment design? What makes them work?
Yeah, look, I think as I said, apartments are getting smaller by necessity because of affordability issues. So key is to make obviously very efficient use of space. What you're finding is that apartments have become a lot more open plan, so that there's really no room anymore for passageways and wasted spaces. Oh. So you find you'll walk in the door and you're in the living space. Storage areas, cupboards, sensible use of space in that regard is important. Quality of bathrooms, quality of kitchens.
Balconies?
Balconies is something that we're always very, very mindful of. I mean, even the small amount of outdoor space is a fantastic addition. And in fact, one of the things that we do as a developer is we never have, often you see air compressors on balconies, which for the air conditioning system. Okay. It's one of the things that we avoid because we view the balcony as a very important part of the overall space that buyers are purchasing. And if you put that unit on that balcony, it takes away from the amenity of that space. So.
One of the apartments in the block series at the moment has no windows. How would you go?
As in no natural ventilation?
Well, look, I'm not sure because we haven't seen the precise finish, but I think it's got a rooftop terrace, but not perhaps a window.
How would you get a permit on that?
Yeah.
I don't know how you
anyway,
I think it's very different every city you go to as well, what people expect. So if you go to Brisbane, people expect a very large balcony because it's obviously a warmer climate and people use their outdoor area a lot more. So there's no one design fits all for apartments.
Right.
Oh, absolutely, and each site is different too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And let's look at the challenges. We've worked out that things are going along nicely, but there's always probably going to be a black swan event or something from left field. You've given some indication as to why you've got an underlying confidence in the apartment market and apartment pricing, but can we delve into the cons for a moment, Andrew?
Well, settlement valuation is a major issue.
Right.
So you might buy at a fixed price and it might take 2 years to build, and then a bank valuer comes in, or a valuer representing a bank comes in and uses a different form of measurement, for example, for the area size. So typically the apartments are sold in the Property Council of Australia's guidelines, which are outside edge of boundary and sort of middle of the party wall. But valuers these days measure the inside face to inside face, and that's a significant and material variation between actually what some people sell. So valuations, settlements, they're issues. Buyers having to put more equity in at settlement, whether they've got that capacity. We haven't had any major settlement issues in Melbourne in the last couple of years, despite some perceived negative feedback. So that's a positive, but it's always an issue. And changes in planning legislation. The planning minister's talking about that at the moment, and that could have a fundamental impact on a number of different things. Design, minimum sizes, like the CEP 65 out of New South Wales, where the government basically dictates size and shape of product, which is going to change the Melbourne market dramatically if that does come in. The
suggestion following that leak to the Financial Review was that prices for studios might go up, that one bedrooms might go up by 40,000, two bedders by perhaps 90,000. Because the requirement is for bigger apartments, that actually reduces the capacity to build as many, and obviously rents would have to go up based on costs. I mean, it's only early days in the consideration of the minimal size for apartments debate in Victoria, but what's your views, Sam?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. If a one-bedroom apartment today is 45 square metres plus a 5 square metre balcony, a total of 50 square metres, and you mandate a minimum 50 square metres of internal space, at $8,000 a metre, obviously you're talking $40,000, and that rises as, obviously as the rate per square metre rises. So there is no question it will have an effect on affordability. The merits of mandating minimum sizes to me, I really can't see it, because I think apartment design should be a market-driven thing. Sure, mandate minimum standards for ventilation and environmentally friendly materials and all that sort of stuff, that's fine. But when it comes to apartment design, and affordability, you really need to leave that to the market to work out, because mandating minimum sizes will, I think, will cause a significant drop in the number of projects that are viable, simply because you may not have the buyers out there who can afford to pay for them.
When the Victorian government's putting so much money into infrastructure, all off the back of property development, it would seem crazy for them to put the handbrake on the Melbourne property market, because the international buyers will just move interstate. They will just go to Brisbane where there aren't those requirements, and they can buy cheaper price per square metre already.
James, your Chinese buyers, what standards do they have? And let's go back also to the issue of the Black Swan event. What could upset their flow?
As far as designs go?
No, as far as coming to Melbourne or Sydney.
Oh, well, just probably the same things that Andrew mentioned before. Rentability, I think, is another important point. You know, what are the absorption rates in the market as far as the supply that's entering into the renting market. So that's another consideration. Yeah. Is there have all of your clients successfully got their money out of China, or is there occasionally a hiccup? No, well, I can actually give you a statistic if you like. We have a 1.3% fallover rate, which means in the last 600-700 properties, you'll excuse my maths, but we've lost about 7 odd sales, which is incredibly high. So the whole thing about trying to get money out of China and trying to find foreign buyers in a country of 1.3 billion is actually factually incorrect. We have an incredibly successful settlement rate.
Right. Let's just, I guess, talk about one of the reasons behind Off the Plan is the capacity of the investor to jumpstart their wealth, as in to get into the market, whereas otherwise they would not be able to. I mean, and is it an Aussie gamble? Or is it something that is not as safe as houses, but what are the fiscal merits of Off the Plan purchasing?
Well, just quickly, in the last 12 months, we've had basically about 75% clearance rates in Melbourne. That's sort of post 2010 highs, and that means that 7.5 out of 10 homes that go to auction every weekend get sold. It means there's a lot of competition. It means it's a very active market. So the landed home market here in Melbourne, the capital growth and the competition for that product has grown and been very intense. So the Off the Plan market, you get to buy with certainty at fixed prices. It's a 10% deposit, the balance in 2 years or 3 years or 18 months. It gives somebody the ability to save that extra 10% to avoid lender's mortgage insurance, which is obviously a large cost impost if you borrow $1 more than 80%. And in Victoria, you save about 90% of your stamp duty. So it's a significant kickstart on a 2-bedroom apartment worth about $600,000. Your average investor and owner-occupier buying Off the Plan in Victoria saves about $28,000 to $32,000. That's a material amount of money. Very different to the New South Wales system and unique in Australia, and is a big driver for interstate purchases, but also for young people to buy here and for local area investors and for international investors. So that key part of the State Revenue Office's sort of plank, or lost my term, but part of their key philosophy and policy drives a significant part of what we do.
Sam?
Look, I think the other thing, buying Off the Plan means that you're buying at prices that that you've locked in 2 years or 3 years prior to the project being completed. And if you look over the last 3 years, I mean, just take our Richmond Abbotsford experience, we were selling at averages of 7,500 a metre 3 years ago. The project we've just finished is at 8,500, and the project we're about to launch will be somewhere around 9. So those buyers who bought, at $7,500 a metre 3 years ago have seen obviously an increment in the value of their apartment by quite a significant proportion, and you can lock that that in, you know, well before you're due to settle.
Many generations of Asian buyers are familiar with off-the-plan purchasing. Sydney and Melbourne buyers, perhaps something in the 80s, 1980s, so it's only a narrow 30-year experience. But what is it that the Asian buyer sees, James, about the off-the-plan potential in terms of jump-starting their wealth?
Well, it's exactly for the same reasons as what a local buyer would, but I think what we generally tend to see is that our clients will invest in two vehicles. One will be government bonds and the other one will be property. So why? Well, because as you mentioned before, they know property, they understand it, you know, and I think that counts for a lot.
But it's also important to consider, if you're not a permanent resident, you cannot buy completed
there's
stock.
that as well, which is a really good point. And so,
Let's finish it up. John, you have $6 billion worth of property on your site. Do you sleep at night? And the 500, I think you're selling 500 a month. What sort of feedback do you get from your clients as to, you know, why it's travelling along quite nicely?
I think market forces are forcing it to travel along quite nicely. So off-the-plan property is hot, especially on the eastern seaboard of Australia. It's also hot in WA, so that's driving demand. We are the only business of our kind, so that means that we're particularly popular and we don't take any commission, so that's good for us. I think the whole market is bubbling along well because Australia's in a really good place at the moment globally with our economy and also our property market. I think Sydney in particular is in this weird state where globally everyone wants to buy in Sydney. If you look at some of the large projects that have gone there, they've got purchases from the UK, from Russia, from everywhere, and people are wanting to buy in Sydney. So that's a lot of the success.
Well, thank you very much for attending today's Property Observer and Investoress webcast. I guess just to finish with, know exactly what you're buying, read the fine print on the web, understand your rights, find out, imagine the dream, and most importantly, inspect the properties that the developers have done prior so that you know that you are buying from a reputable lot. Thank you very much for attending. Good night.
Thank you.